Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, The Hidden Cost of Ad Skipping. But first, podcasting is full of opportunities, and I want to give you the tools to show brands and future clients those opportunities. Join me next Wednesday, August 7th at 2 p.m. Eastern for the free webinar, Building a Sales Pitch for Podcasting. There'll be a link to register in the show notes or on the soundsprofitable.com version of this newsletter. In our last research study here at Sounds Profitable ad nauseum, we looked at a whole host of consumer perceptions about advertising in podcasts. I've talked about frequency, repetition, and the importance of good creative in this podcast before. But there was another insight from this study that has had its sinister claws in me now for a few weeks. Ad nauseum looked at some of the reasons why people who say they skip ads in podcasts engage in this behavior, and it's clear that there's no one monolithic "I just hate ads" reason that's behind it all. Some people hate ads of any kind, sure, but more commonly, people complain about bad ads, ads that don't tell them anything new, or ads that are just poorly targeted or not relevant to their needs. I generally don't skip ads, but this is because A, I know that the ad load of the shows I listen to is not particularly onerous, and B, I am super lazy. There is a C, though, and it's something that I'm aware of as an industry professional that might not be something your listeners know. Skipping ads hurts the show. I wonder if this is something that the listeners do know, and more importantly, if the hosts of those shows know it as well. I've seen all kinds of arguments around this and even some justifications for ad skipping. Well, heck, there are apps that will even do this for you. As a listener, you're entirely justified in saying, "I don't care." And some creators probably don't either. But at least hear me out on this. Ad skipping does hurt the show, and even the entire industry, because of one simple, unignorable fact. Advertising actually works. Yeah, turns out it does. That's why brands do it. They're smart that way. Ads only work, however, when they are heard. The more unheard ads that are bought, even if the show in the short term gets some kind of CPM or impression rate for those unheard ads, the worse those ads perform. You can do all the crazy math you want to around this, but unheard ads don't work, which lowers the ultimate effectiveness of the ad, the campaign, and even the perceived effectiveness of podcasting itself. Ads aren't the only way to monetize a podcast, I realize that, but it's the main way that we monetize podcasts. And the effectiveness of podcast ads is why we can charge the CPMs we do, which are much higher than radios, for instance, which is in turn why we don't have to stuff 18 spots into a podcast. Again, see radio. If this is a thing that concerns you and you are a creator, there is something very simple that you can do, and it stems from one of the surprising findings of ad nauseum. 3/4 of podcast listeners don't believe or don't know that ad skipping hurts their favorite podcast. I find this disconnect highly unusual because we know from multiple sources of data that people do make positive connections between the brands that advertise on their favorite podcasts and the support of those brands for their favorite creators. So the positive aspects of that linkage are clear to listeners. But we haven't made the corollary case here. If that support is taken away through skipping brand messages, it can actually hurt the creator. Now, I'm not saying we have to go insane here as podcasters about how we talk about ads, but at the very least, maybe we can talk less dismissively about them. Every time I hear a podcaster toss off a comment like, "Well, it's time to pay the bills," a puppy dies somewhere. At the very least, we can actively show gratitude and encourage our listeners to at least hear the ads out. I would love to see the 25% from ad nauseum who agree that it might reduce the financial support for the podcast increase in the coming years, if for nothing else than an increased awareness of this central fact of ad-supported podcasting. That which can be giveth can also be taken away. By the way, there's another stat I'd love to see an increase in that's very closely to that stat tied above. We asked people who had used a promo code in a podcast to buy something why they chose to use it, and they could select multiple options here. The option that was selected the least by 19% of promo code users was, "I want the podcast to get credit for my purchase." Now that stat, again, is among people who have used promo codes. They heard the ad, and the ad worked. And while the primary driver for promo code usage will always be to save money, those responses, again, were not exclusive. You could have selected more than one. And I'd love to see that 19% who want their favorite shows to get credit to be higher in the future. There's something that podcasts can do that many other media cannot. The stars of the show can directly shout out advertisers and thank them and impress upon listeners just how important they are to the future of the show. Mariska Hargitay can't look up from a murder investigation on Law & Order and mug for the camera while telling viewers that this autopsy is brought to you by Mr. Clean gets those stains out. But you can. I think we can do more to at least impress upon our listeners that hearing the show out, all of the show, really does support them and make future content possible. Ultimately, there's a lot about our ads that podcasters should be proud of. The main findings of Ad Nauseam were that we haven't ruined podcasting with ads. Listeners expect to hear some, and we aren't giving them more than they expect. Podcast listeners pay more attention to ads than consumers of other media channels, and part of that is because the industry is actually doing a pretty good job selling the right ads for the right shows and keeping the ad loads down. The listening experience of podcasting is superior to almost any other kind of ad-supported content, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that on our shows. We don't ask much of our listeners, so maybe this one small request won't hurt, and it could even help. We're all in sales, like it or not. Speaking of requests, if you want to get an impactful crash course on structuring an informative, entertaining, and research-supported sales pitch for your podcast or your network, I'm giving a free webinar next Wednesday on crafting a compelling sales pitch in podcasting. There's more information in the show notes, and I hope you'll join me. If you skipped this small ad, know that it hurt me deeply. Thanks again for listening to this podcast. This episode is hosted on Spreaker. I'm Tom Webster, and I'll see you next week.